We're back now with Bob Schieffer, plus Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today and author of The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty. Also joining us is Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal. All three of these very esteemed journalists have covered Bush 41 and Washington through the years, so can really give us that perspective. And Jerry, I want to start with you because you've been taking a look at the impact 41 had in terms of global leadership. Yeah. What was that legacy?
Well, I mean, it's a remarkable period of time. You had the Tiananmen Square episode, you had the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany. But I think there are two things really that ought to be remembered. One is he oversaw the end of the Cold War and the unification of Germany without a shot being fired, which was a really remarkable achievement, was not a foregone conclusion. He probably didn't get enough credit for it at the time.
Angela Merkel gave him credit for it the other day.
Thank God, she should have. So, and the second, of course, the Iraq War. And I think what's interesting about the first Gulf War was he went into Kuwait, he led a coalition, they drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait back into Iraq, and then he stopped. In other words, he said, our mission is limited, we're going to free Kuwait, and we're not going to go in and try to change the government in Iraq. And so we learned some years later that was a very wise decision.
What you're describing here, multilateralism, working with allies, restraint, speaking out at times about shared values versus national interests. This sounds like a in some ways, anachronistic description of Republican Party, values and standards. Is it?
George Bush was part of that generation that shaped world order after World War II. And just to add to one thing that Jerry said, in addition to going into Kuwait and then going back and stopping, he also got that remarkable coalition of countries that he put together to pay for it,
right.
Which is almost unheard of in this day and time. They actually paid for it. But George Bush he represented mainstream Republican thinking of that time, and that is that America is part of the world. He had great respect for our alliances. He understood that when America was at its best was when we were working with people who shared our values, our allies. He had a great respect for NATO and all of these alliances that came about after World War II. So the fact that he had all these jobs, he had this great resume, he actually learned from it. I mean, I think you can say that he while he was there, he just didn't sit around. He learned a lot.
And it's interesting, Susan, because these days we talk about not being part of Washington, coming in with different experience as being a virtue, whereas what you're describing is he held experience at the very highest levels of power bases here in Washington before getting to the Oval Office.
And the passage of time has been kind to George H.W. Bush. We talk about journalism being the first draft of history, but the second draft sometimes looks different than the first draft. And I think some of the things that some of the consequences of his presidency look so much better with the passage of time, including, for instance, his restraint in dealing with Saddam Hussein and the situation in Iraq. Some presidents seem smaller after a little time has passed. George Bush seems bigger than he did at the time he was defeated for a second term, something that left a terrible wound, although I think not some big scars on him, healed when his son was then elected.
And what is the domestic legacy here? I mean, we're talking about his place in the world, but who was he to America?
So, his domestic legacy is marred somewhat because he was seen as being a little insensitive or unaware, not in touch with the economic anxieties Americans were feeling. In 1992, Bill Clinton was exquisitely, I'm not sure I can say that word, aware of that. But his domestic legacy is actually pretty muscular. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a significant piece of legislation. He gave a national address on addressing AIDS. And I think it's easy for us to forget now how much of a breakthrough that was at that time, a great stigma attached to HIV/AIDS. He gave an address, and in the address talked about the lessons he learned from the death of his daughter from leukemia. At the time she died, leukemia also had a great stigma. He talked about the need to address people with AIDS with respect and dignity, and that was a remarkable speech that he gave during his presidency.
I've read interviews where 41 said he didn't like the word dynasty or, talking about his family. But he was the son of a senator and the father of a president. is the Bush family still going to continue to be part of this sort of political landscape of this country, or are we seeing the sun set on the type of republicanism, the type of leader that you all are describing?
Well, in a way, I think that George H.W. Bush is sort of the last of the breed. I mean, this was a generation, as Bob said, that when he came to Washington, the town was full of people who were bonded by joint service in World War II. Which was more important than where they came from, more important than the party they represented. And that's been lost. And I think one of the other things that's been lost is the kind of the sense of decency and civility that I think he represented, and that in many ways the Bush family represented. And the Bush family's political history is woven all through the 20th century history of America. Will that be true in the 21st century? I'm not so sure. But there is a sense in which I think the George H.W. Bush version of republicanism is kind of gone.
That's an interesting point, too. I mean, George H.W. Bush and his son both had great respect for the presidency, the office of the presidency. George W. Bush, you didn't come into the Oval Office unless you were wearing a suit and tie. And he got that from his dad. I mean, you can say, well, that's kind of whatever. But the fact is, it shows the respect and the dignity that the office deserves. And they were very big on that, and I think they were right about it.
And they extended that to the current president. Obviously the Bush family had a lot of conflicts with Donald Trump, including the fact that he defeated Jeb Bush for the Republican nomination in 2016. We know that the Bushes George and Barbara Bush didn't vote for Donald Trump, but he's invited to the funeral. And I think there was never any question that would happen, because in George Bush's mind, that was the right thing to do, to show respect to the current occupant.
He did not attend Barbara Bush's funeral.
He did not. Now, there is some history where sitting presidents do not attend the funerals of former first ladies. So that was not a break with precedent. But we have little doubt that Barbara Bush did not think much of Donald Trump. And she was a woman who spoke her mind. She wrote in her son's name when she voted in 2016 for president.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, all of you. I know throughout the week we're going to be remembering the legacy of 41 here on CBS.